go ahead, since it is 12:01. I'm going to read from my script, introduce you all, and then I'll basically just hand it all over to you. So, but
Oh,
thank
if
you
I
so
could
much.
interrupt real quick, I'm sorry.
Sure, sure.
Lindsay had requested Dave to see if it was okay if this was recorded.
Oh yeah,
We
yeah.
were gonna, okay.
That's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
And
Thank
Miles,
you.
you've got the slides queued up to
Good to go.
share. All right.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much. All right, I'll go ahead and start my little spiel here. Might take a minute because you both have such amazing resumes. So give me a second. All right. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us at Secular AZ today. For those of you who are joining us, feel free to put your name in the chat, in the webinar, or on Facebook. Let us know who you are, where you're from, why you're here. You know, white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to our democracy, and Secular AZ is your voice for the separation of religion and government in the state of Arizona. We're a nonprofit organization, and like I said, we act as your voice to elected officials across all elected position at every single level. So be sure to check out all of our social media channels and like, subscribe, and share. I'm gonna see if maybe Lindsay could put some of those links in there for you to do so. I recently took a class where somebody said, you know, you're supposed to do that every time. So here I am. You're gonna hear it every single time. Like, subscribe, and share. We do have incredible programming, including our Friday updates from all kinds of amazing speakers. We have historians, authors, elected officials, journalists, you name it. Next Friday, we are going to be speaking to Dr. Matthew Taylor, and he will be discussing the growing new apostolic reformation movement in Arizona and beyond. But for today, we have two very special guests. First, we have Dr. David Buckley. He is an associate professor of political science and Paul Weber Endowed Chair in Politics, Science, and Religion at the University of Louisville. Wait a second. Oh, wait, that's correct. Okay, where he is also director of the Center for Asian Democracy. He served as a senior advisor in the State Department's Secretary's Office of Religion and Global Affairs via the Council on Foreign Relations in International Affairs Fellowship from August 2016 to July 2017. His research focuses on the relationship between religion and democracy. His first book, Faithful to Secularism: The Religious Politics of Democracy in Ireland, Senegal, and the Philippines, was awarded the 2018 Religion and International Relations Book Award by the International Studies Association. He's currently working on two major research projects. One examines the role of religious groups in responding to human rights abuses in Rodrigo's Duterte's Philippines, and the other explores the impact of religion on Trump administration foreign policy. His research and writing has appeared in leading journals of political science and media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Gosh, my mouth is not keeping up with my brain today. Miles T. Armaly is an associate professor of political science at the University of Mississippi. He received a PhD in political science from Michigan State University in 2017. His research broadly centers on on politics and political behavior, with a particular focus on public evaluations of judicial institutions in the United States and contemporary attitudes and orientations, such as polarization, support for political violence, and perceived victimhood. His research has been published or is forthcoming in outlets such as Perspectives on Politics, Political Research Quarterly, Political Behavior, Political Science Research and Methods, Journal of Law and Courts, and Political Psychology. So, wow. Welcome to you both. Incredible for both of you to join our little nonprofit today. And I want to hear as much as you have to say. So I'm going to just go ahead and hand it right over to you all. And I'll try to keep it down until we have questions. Now, quick question. Would you like questions as they come, or do you want to wait till the end?
What do you think? Maybe you guys could someone keep an eye on the chat, and if there's one that is like, I need this answered right now, I don't know what you're talking about, you could interrupt us. We do it right away. And if it's a bigger picture question, we can wait until the end. How about that?
Perfect. All right.
Yeah, I don't mind being interrupted. Yeah, especially if people are saying.
Okay, great. Go ahead and take it away, gentlemen. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having us. I'm going to share my screen here. And we're going to kind of bounce back and forth here. And to start it off, Professor Buckley is going to give us a little bit of an introduction on the topic here today.
All right, great. Thanks, Miles. And we should also say right from the top that this also represents research that we, from start to finish, we're working with my colleague here at U of L and Miles's co-author, Professor Adam Enders, on too. And just so that everyone knows that this was a really collaborative research effort. So thanks very much. All right, next slide, Miles. Okay, so the basic motivation for this talk and for this project that the talk is coming out of is kind of twofold. On the one hand, this is an image from January 6th that I'm going to guess many people on this webinar might actually have even seen before, right? This is an image from outside of the Capitol on that day, and one of many examples that we could find very easily of Christian imagery, symbolism, scriptural citation, even religious practice taking place in and around January 6th, right? This caught our eyes as researchers. But also, click, Miles. We know, right, from political research related to religion and violence, that actually ideas on their own, including ideas like what we think of as Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, don't turn into politics automatically on their own, right? This is an image of a kind of infamous study from the Rand Corporation from about 2 decades ago now, after September 11th, that was a part of this big move to promote moderate Islam, right, after those terrorist attacks, with the idea that the problem driving political violence was a form of Islam, and so we needed better beliefs to have better religion, right? This scholarship hasn't held up very well, right, in the realm of terrorism and political violence. We know actually that ideas need to be organized, right? And so when we go into this project, that's what we're interested in looking at. On the one hand, the links potentially, and Miles, you can click to the agenda here for the talk, just go all the way through, yeah. On the one hand, at a basic level, do we think that there is likely a link between ideas tied to Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism and political violence? Probably, actually, right? We do expect that. But we also think that those ideas are likely to be especially strongly linked to support for violence when they're linked to other characteristics that make people suspect or subject to extreme elite cues, right? And we're going to talk about what we mean by that as the talk goes on. So I'm going to get out of the way and let Miles cue us up first with some of his research on political violence, kind of from a bottom-up perspective. And then I'm going to come back with some of the story about more of the top-down dynamic, this question of why especially mid-level religious elites, what we call meso-level religious elites, might matter towards activating Christian nationalism. And then we'll get into some of the stats. We won't go into too much detail on sort of complicated models, but we'll get across the point of our argument and show you some data. Miles will get us started there, and then I'll come back in with a bit on the data too. So with that, Miles, maybe get us going on political violence from the bottom up.
Sure. Thank you. And so, our broad topic here is about violence and Christian nationalism, but I think it's important to also discuss what leads to violence outside of the context of nationalism and how those things come together to condition the effects of Christian nationalism. And a lot of the research on support for political violence comes at it from many different angles. It's showing there are top-down and bottom-up effects, right? And for our theory on violence and Christian nationalism, both the top-down and bottom-up elements are critical. The literature has shown myriad factors relating to support for violence. I'm going to show you a few in just a second, but there are many, many things that relate to support for violence. As the insurrection attempt or the whatever you want to call the January 6th events identify, it seems that there is this link, at least anecdotally in that context, between violence and Christian nationalism. But there's also empirical support for that relationship. And again, we see this as sort of what we call kind of a dual-edged sword. It's not enough to be a Christian nationalist. That is likely not enough to support violence on its own. And attempts to cue violence among those who do not support Christian nationalism are also likely to be fruitless. So I'm going to start with this bottom-up approach. There are some personality traits, some basic dispositions, some orientations in life that sort of naturally lead or lend themselves to support for both violence and Christian nationalism, which is one way that we can begin to discern a link between violence and Christian nationalism as sort of step one in our theory. And then, of course, as Professor Buckley just said, we'll come back and do the top-down approach in just a second. So in work that Professor Adam Enders and I have on more general correlates of political violence, we find a bevy of things relate to support for political violence. And what you're looking at here is pairwise correlations between the characteristic or the attitude or orientation listed along the Y or the vertical axis, right? Correlations, of course, range from -1 to 1, values above 0 being positive. And I'm just going to point out a couple of things, but you can see that there are many here. If you can follow my cursor, we're pointing to some things about one's lot in life, perceptions about how the world treats them and how people interact with the world, things like perceived victimhood, individual level anxiety, and perceptions of powerlessness. These things, understandably in some contexts, relate to support for violence. Perhaps people wish to wrest control of their lives back from some perceived powers that be, if you will. We also see, important for our conversation today, conspiratorial thinking. I think it makes a lot of sense if you think again of the January 6th events. There was a lot of conspiratorial rhetoric happening that day, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the links between conspiracism, Christian nationalism, and support for violence. We can also see white identity and a characteristic called racial resentment. So there are both in-group and out-group racial elements involved here. And a couple more that are relevant for our talk here today. We see that evangelical status is related to support for violence. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. That doesn't strike us as very explanatory. We think Christian nationalism is a more powerful explanation than any type of denomination or any type of religiosity itself. And then there's a couple of other things that strike us as relatively interesting. Military service is related to support for violence. Education, those who are more educated, surprisingly, are a little more supportive. And then the only negative relationship here we see is between being female and supporting violence. So what we're suggesting is that there are many, many things that relate to support for violence. Of course, it's not just Christian nationalism. There are many things, but we think these general antecedents in concert with Christian nationalism can help offer a better, more robust explanation, especially when considering both the top-down and bottom-up approaches. Another series of attitudes has received a lot of attention recently with respect to support for political violence. And this is something called, it's a collection of attitudes commonly called the dark triad. And more recently, I've seen people calling these antisocial orientations or antisociality. And so the three constitutive components of this dark triad are narcissism, or of course, entitlement, the belief that grandiosity, Machiavellianism, which is sort of this domineering, manipulative personality trait, and then psychopathy, a remorselessness. And this combination of things supports, rather, individuals who are high in these characteristics tend to support political violence more than those low in these characteristics. And so this dark triad has received a lot of attention with respect to support for political violence. But in as much as today we're trying to build this theory out with respect to individual level traits and Christian nationalism in their support for violence, it's also important to note, that underlying Christian nationalism to some degree are these antisocial traits. And so in some emerging research, you can see here attributed to another political scientist, Paul Weber, if you ask people these dark triad items in the secular context, and then you ask them those same items in the religious context, those who are non-religious have different orientations on these things. One may be, say, Machiavellian in the social context, but not the religious. However, as you can see up in this top distribution, these two distributions, individuals who are more religious, that is to say, attend weekly services, Their religious antisociality looks more like their secular antisociality. So this is one step in our attempt to build a relationship or build a theory on these antisocial personality traits, myriad other traits, and Christian nationalism as they relate to political violence. So what's kind of missing from these baseline accounts, again, is this explicit Christian nationalist point of view, this explicit ideology about marrying American values and perceived Christian values. And so the insurrection gives us great reason to believe that Christian nationalism underlies support, but also exacerbates the other forces that lend themselves to support for violence. And so what else underlies Christian nationalism? There's been scores of research in the last 5 to 10 years on this question, and we've listed several of them here. Again, we don't think that these are perfect explanations for support for violence or for Christian nationalism, but again, they help us get a good sense of what Christian nationalism looks like. Things like political conservatism, residence in the South or more rural areas. Some evangelical traditions, again, evangelicalism itself is not a great explanation for support for violence, but some elements of it are, such as biblical literalism. We think the research shows perceived threat to Christianity is really critical here. A lot of our theory rests on perceived threat and the inability to construct boundaries around politics versus religion. Many cultural and identity concerns come up here. Again, we'll be talking in a little bit about racial and religious identities, and these play into cultural identities and concerns about secularization, immigration, threat to cultural norms. Outgroup attitudes, things like patriotism, all of these things relate to Christian nationalism. It's our understanding that you have had a lot of these webinars about Christian nationalism recently, so we won't bore you with too many details on what exactly goes into Christian nationalism. But what we think still is unanswered with all of these things, we know that there are some correlates that are shared among both support for violence and Christian nationalism, but still unanswered is how exactly we think Christian nationalism links with violence. And to complete that component of our theory, we have to return to the top down, the conversation of meso-level elites. And here I'll turn it back to Dave to fill us in on how that works. Dave, you're muted.
Yeah.
You'd think that after 3 years we'd get that figured out. There we go. All right. So the story that Miles has just been telling, right, is about this bottom-up process, individual beliefs related to violence and Christian nationalism. What we try to argue in the paper is that to complete the story about how Christian nationalism is linked to violence, we need actually to take a step back up to the level of elite cue giving, right? So what I have up here on the screen are a couple of things, some quotes from prominent sort of Christian spokespeople, I suppose, of Trumpism, for lack of a better word, in the both pre-January 6th period, immediately after the election, and then getting very close to January 6th, especially through the so-called Jericho March. These were events that took place in and around, well, actually around the country, but including in Washington, D.C., in the immediate lead up to the January 6th events. And we think that these kinds of events are very important because what we argue in the research that we've published is that it's these kinds of meso-level elite cues, right? Not necessarily a national level religious leader, but somebody who is in the sort of more lived experience, right? The mid-level religious leaders and cue givers that could be especially important to activating Christian nationalism. What we also, though, argue in the paper is that these cues might not just be coming from clergy, right? And here, just click one more time, Miles. Here we have not a noted Christian pastor. I'm curious if folks in the audience might know who this is. This is Alex Jones, right? But appearing on the stage at Jericho March event, right? Conspiratorial beliefs, things related to white identity grievance, things related to victimhood, right? have all been kind of tied up with some of the Christian nationalist rhetoric around the election, and we think that this could be especially important in basically explaining whose Christian nationalism gets activated in such a way that it becomes linked to violence, right? So in other words, to sort of simplify things down, Christian nationalist beliefs matter for violence when linked to these kinds of meso-level cues, both from religious sources, but also from dark triad sources like Jones. All right, Miles, so click us forward to the next slide. I'll give you just a little bit of political science theory here. I'm not going to run through this word for word. On the one hand, we do think, coming out of the religion and violence literature, that religion and nationalism may become linked together, right, in ways that might lead to support for violence. There is support, including, I think, in some research that you all know about, for this idea that Christian nationalism in particular, right, has become linked to not only things like support for Donald Trump, but also support for violent police violence, and also support or resistance to gun control, right? So there is a literature related to this stuff. But we also know, coming out of the general religion and violence literature, some of which is about Christianity, but much of which is actually about political Islam, that the link between religious beliefs and violence is likely to be what social scientists call conditional. In other words, it's stronger in some contexts than in others, right? Research from the Brennan Center sort of documents the fact that consistently, right, research that has focused on extremist ideology has had a hard time pointing down consistent links between ideology and actual support for violence. In many studies dealing with political Islam and violence, scholars have found weak individual level evidence that religiosity or religious political beliefs are linked to support for violence, right? As Peter Mandeville and Melissa Nozell note in a policy brief from the U.S. Institute of Peace back in 2017, the role of religion as a potential driver of violent extremism is significant, but religion usually interacts with a wide range of other factors, right? Again, almost all of these authors here are actually writing about religion and violence in the context of political Islam, right? But we think that this basic instinct probably applies to the links between Christian nationalism and violence too. Okay, Miles, next slide. So in what ways do we think that this might be true? Well, we especially think that what research in social science frequently refers to as meso-level, mid-level political and religious elites might be especially important in activating grassroots beliefs, right? So there's a lot of research on the role of local clergy, for instance, and other local social leaders in activating ties between religion and nationalism and violence. And we also know from research from folks studying issues like immigration attitudes, for instance, like Michelle Margolis's research that I reference here, that religious elites might have an ability to change individual attitudes or activate individual attitudes in different ways on issues where those attitudes are malleable or flexible, right? So what might then indicate individuals who are more likely to experience the kind of extreme cues that might activate Christian nationalism? Well, in the paper, we say there's three things that are especially likely to indicate the exposure to these kinds of cues. People who perceive themselves as being victimized, people who have senses of racial and religious grievance in their identity, and people who report strong exposure to conspiratorial information sources, right? And we think that there's good reason to expect then that when it comes to Christian nationalism and violence, someone's Christian nationalist beliefs would become most strongly linked to support for violence when they're also being exposed to these kinds of dark triad related meso-level cues, right? So it's Christian nationalist beliefs plus meso-level cues that add up to a story that becomes more problematic. So now Miles can take us into some of the data that we have related to this.
Yes, and so to test our combined bottom-up and top-down theory, we turn to a survey, nationally representative at the quota-based nationally representative survey from a survey firm called Lucid. And we collected 1,100 responses from U.S. adults, which reflect the composition of the nation based on census estimates. We collected these data in February of 2021. We're only about 6 weeks, if 6 weeks, somewhere between 5 and 6.5 weeks after the insurrection, and so we think this is a pretty poignant time there to be collecting these attitudes, because part of what we're interested in is general support for political violence, but more specifically, one of the things we're asking about is the specific violence on January 6th. So our outcomes of interest there are two. The first is a justification for the Capitol riot. And for that, we assess using a 5-point strongly disagree to strongly agree scale, or rather, they're coded such that that agreement indicates support. And so the riots at the U.S. Capitol building on January 6th were justified. In addition, we try to capture general support for violence, and we do that using 3 items, 3 survey items, also on strongly agree to strongly disagree scales, which we then combine into a single measure of support for violence. And here we ask about the acceptability of violence in advancing political goals, whether it's justified if others are violent first, and the like. One thing I think is worth pointing out about the way that we measure support for violence, it deviates slightly from other efforts to measure violence, which are often asking about partisanship explicitly. So it might ask a Republican respondent about their support for violence against Democrats. We don't do that. We want general attitudes regarding support for political violence. As for our other variables of interest, the independent variables, of course, those are the things that we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so. Christian nationalism. Again, I suspect that you have some idea, if you've been following along with these webinars, on what it means to measure Christian nationalism. It's the blending of American and Christian identity. But we also measure a specific form of racial identity, which is white identity. Much of the scholarship, especially more recently on Christian nationalism, has taken to referring to it as white Christian nationalism. And we think that white identity, or attachment to one's whiteness, not being white, but the strength of the attachment to whiteness, and the belief that policies that affect whites affect all of them, or policies that affect non-whites also affect whites, right? Sort of this, what some scholars in the racial literature called linked fate. It's a type of sort of white linked fate. We measure that using a scale by scholar Ashley Ardina. Perceived victimhood is a scale that Professor Enders and I have developed. It captures 2 things, right? The belief that the world's doing it to you, belief that there's nothing to be done, the woe is me type of a situation, and also the fact that there are powers that be. So it's both hand-wringing and it's finger-pointing. And again, this is perceptual. It has nothing to do with what you might call genuine victimhood. And then finally, in as much as we're attempting to look at conspiratorial thinking, we, instead of using abstract support for conspiracism, we asked about support for QAnon specifically. And this is an intentional choice. QAnon was very present on January 6th. In much of that imagery, in much of the rhetoric, QAnon is present. And so we ask about support for QAnon specifically. Now, this presents somewhat of an analytical challenge, because we first had to ask whether people were aware of QAnon. Only about 2/3 of the sample were. So later on, when we're showing you these effects, keep in mind that they're different sample sizes. So for the QAnon effects specifically, it's fewer people. We can only really ask people who knew about QAnon whether they supported the sort of the organization. I don't think that's the right term, but it's the movement, if you will. And so to begin, we're just going to show you aggregate level support for both the Capitol riot, or thinking that it was justified, and broad support for political violence. And we can wipe our brows a little bit, because support is low. On average, support is really low. Most people do not believe the Capitol riot was justified, to the tune of almost 60%, strongly disagree with it being unjustified. And so somewhere around 80% of our sample either strongly disagree that it's justified, disagree, or are in the middle. neither agree nor disagree. Now, I suppose you could take a neither nor response there as a little more normatively concerning than the disagreement, but the brunt of it is most people don't support the riot. Likewise, for support for political violence, it's low. Most people are not at all supportive of political violence. And this is commensurate with existing research, so this is not unique to our sample. Most research finds when asking abstract questions about support for violence, it's quite low. First, again, recall that our theory is advanced in two parts. First, there's the bottom-up element, which is to say people have these orientations and these attitudes, and they're likely to relate to violence. The second part, which I'll show you on the next slide, is the conditional part. This is the sort of unconditional part. We think that there is a baseline relationship between, say, Christian nationalism and support for violence, white identity and support for violence, so on and so forth. This is precisely what we find. So if you'll follow my cursor here for the Christian nationalism on the belief that the Capitol riot was justified, those very low in Christian nationalism do not support or do not believe that the riot was justified. However, as we move from left to right, that is to say from low Christian nationalism to high Christian nationalism, that value increases to a statistically significant degree, such that those who are Christian nationalist are nearly twice as likely as to say the Capitol riot was justified. I think it's worth pointing out that, again, recall that our scale is 1 to 5. Most people are still not supportive. So even those who are heavily Christian nationalist or heavily support QAnon, there's still only about middling levels of belief that is justified. But the increase is what we're interested in, and the increase is what presents as normatively concerning. So that same relationship that I just described with respect to Christian nationalism and the belief that the Capitol riot was justified applies across all of these comparisons. So those low in white identity don't believe it was justified, those high in white identity do. Likewise with victimhood and support for QAnon, and the same applies for a more broad general acceptance of violence scale. Okay, so we do have support for our baseline theoretical expectation that there's a bottom up, that individuals who are attached to their whiteness that support QAnon are going to support violence more. So we do have support for that bottom up component. But a major component of our theory is the top down element, that these meso-level elites are activating these individual level orientations or perceptions, right? Stated differently, our theory is that rhetoric can activate the link between Christian nationalism and violence. And what you're seeing here are what we call the conditional effects. And so for those of you who love calculus, this is the marginal effect. This is the instantaneous rate of change. It's the partial derivative, right? So let me walk you through here this for white identity here on the belief that the Capitol riot is justified. On the previous slide, what we were showing on the y-axis, the vertical axis, was support for violence or belief that the Capitol riot is justified. This is not true in these figures. What we're showing here is the effect of white identity, the effect of Christian nationalism on support for violence across white identity, okay? And so what you're seeing here, if you follow my cursor, for low levels of white identity, the effect of Christian nationalism on political violence or on the belief that the Capitol riot is justified is null. There isn't a meaningful effect. However, as we increase from left to right in white identity, we see a strengthening of that link between Christian nationalism and violence. In other words, those low in white identity, there's really not a link between Christian nationalism and support for violence. For those high in white identity, that link is there and it's statistically significant. We see the same thing for perceived victimhood and for support for QAnon. And of course, we see very similar effects in these additional figures regarding acceptance of violence. So in the last two slides across these two figures, we've demonstrated both support for the bottom-up theory, that individual level traits relate to support for violence, but also the top-down theory, that these traits, or rather that rhetoric can exacerbate these traits, can activate things like white identity, like perceived victimhood, and like conspiratorial thinking, and increase the relationship between Christian nationalism and support for violence among those individuals high in those traits. So it's not enough for one to be a Christian nationalist and then just go out and commit violence. In contexts like that, we tend to call those sort of lone wolf attacks, things like that. It's also likely not enough for a meso-level elite to be speaking and say, we got to go out in the streets and commit some violence. If one's not prone to do that, that call is not likely to work. It's the combination. So one has to have the existing attitudes and orientations, and then they can be activated by those meso-level elites. And that's what we've shown here in these conditional effects. But there's one more important step in the whole conversation here, and that's we're going to go back to Dave here to discuss emerging research on whether people in the pews are hearing these. Are the meso-level elite messages reaching members in the pews?
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Miles. Yeah. So at the end of the first paper, I think we all three of us thought, all right, well, this is an interesting story. And we basically think we have data that supports it. But at the same time, the story involves people actually hearing these cues. And we didn't have data on that because in a way that's not what, at first we didn't set up the study to do that. So what we've done in a subsequent wave is try to actually get some data on it. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about now. This is actually still unpublished data, but it has been presented at conferences, and we feel pretty good about some of the initial findings here. Okay, well, what's relevant at the meso level? I mean, again, on the left, we have the classic image from January 6th itself, but this isn't actually how most people receive their political religious cues in their lived experience, right? The lived experience of religion in this country happens in a lot of different ways. It happens through social media sometimes it happens very informally, but we have lots of research that suggests that the most important and most root, or not the most, but a very important, let's say that way in which individuals experience these kinds of meso-level religious cues are through American religious congregations, right? If you could just click one more time, Miles. There's a long religious tradition going back to a kind of classic work from Ken Wald that thinks of churches as political communities, not just religious communities, but political communities, right? Where cues are delivered, where bonds are built that can facilitate collective action in lots of ways, right? Both maybe desirable and problematic. So that's what we set out to do in a subsequent wave of the study. And I'm just going to show you a couple of snapshots of that data for a few minutes here. So at a basic level, first what we did was we asked Americans how often they hear certain sermon topics related to politics in their religious congregation. We didn't just ask about these kind of Christian nationalist themes. We asked about a whole bunch of stuff so that people wouldn't know exactly what we were up to, right? So we asked about, did they hear about immigration? Did they hear about abortion? Did they hear about environmental concerns, right? We asked a whole battery, but these are just the ones related to Christian nationalism that we've pulled out here. In the first column, you'll see the results for those who simply report attending religious services ever, right? In the second column, we focus in just on Christians because we would think that that's actually the ones who are relevant here, right? And then in the third column, furthest to the right, we look at those Christians who say that they actually attend religious services monthly or more, right? There are a few different ways that you could come at this data. At the bottom, what we do is code things up so that you can see who reports hearing at least one Christian nationalist sermon theme, right, recently. And among those who attend the most regularly, it's almost half, right? Among those who attend less regularly, it's a little bit less, but it's still a significant number, right? We do have variability across the items, but at a basic level, these cues are being delivered, right? We do hear these kinds of, or we have people reporting, right, that these kinds of themes are being mentioned in their congregations. To visualize it in a different way, Miles, you can click forward. We can show you just at a basic level what this distribution looks like. So it's true that actually the largest single category, right, in our data, even among just Christians, which is the category on the right, is those who don't report hearing Christian nationalist themes, right? And then we do get some variability. Most actually of those who do report hearing some are actually only hearing one of these topics, right? It's a really small slice who are reporting hearing all four of these themes. As social scientists, this is interesting in a couple of ways. One, it does show that there's the real presence of these kinds of themes in congregations. So that's interesting and important to us, I think. But it also shows there's variation, right? That everyone is not the same, that people are getting exposed to these cues at different levels. And so what that then allows us to do is to test the impact of that. And so I'm just going to very briefly show you a graph next that will use being exposed to Christian nationalist sermons as an independent variable and show its effect on four different dependent variables. So in the upper left, we have support for political violence. In the upper right, we have conspiratorial beliefs. In the lower left, we have support for a strong leader instead of democracy. And on the bottom right, we have an index of kind of beliefs about the deep state conspiring against elected officials, right? In all of these cases, the positive slope of that line is showing you that being exposed to Christian nationalist sermons in your congregation positively correlates with all of these kind of normatively problematic indicators of democratic backsliding. One point that I want to clarify here, if you can click one more time, Miles, this is quantitatively after controlling for someone's individual Christian nationalist beliefs. So in other words, we're not showing this here, but standard statistical controls for demographics and partisanship are included, but we're also controlling for someone's individual beliefs, right? So this is basically saying that over and above their individual beliefs, reporting being exposed to these cues in their congregations is having an additional additive effect on their support for violence, conspiratorial beliefs, deep state beliefs, and support for strong leadership. So we do think that this is, again, consistent with the importance of studying that meso level and the impact of those meso level beliefs on potentially activating Christian nationalism. So I'll just wrap up, or do you want to wrap up, Miles? We actually didn't talk about wrapping up. I'll just wrap it up because we want to have a conversation too. You might be curious, well, what's the real extent of this threat, right? We say that the real threat is where Christian nationalism kind of combines with these other dispositions. This is people who appear in the top quartile, so the top 25% of all four of those belief dispositions, right? It's 6% of whites overall, a little over 11% of white evangelicals overall, and almost 20% of white weekly churchgoers, right? So there are different ways that you could slice it. It's definitely not a majority, but it is actually, we think, a substantively large minority, especially among whites who identify as Christians. In terms of next steps, there's different things we could talk about. One is to try to actually do some experimentation here to test out the effects of exposing people to Christian nationalist cues. One thing that I'm personally very interested in is we've been today giving you a story of how religion changes politics, maybe, right? Religious beliefs changes political violence or changes our political behavior. I think there's also a lot of evidence that political beliefs, including those tied to nationalism, are changing American religion, right? Are leading to kind of polarization within our religious communities. And we've got some sort of preliminary analysis that's related to how Christian nationalism might be further polarizing our religious communities, not just our politics, but our religious communities. There's a lot of work going on right now that we can discuss a bit, although we're not actually doing it, where scholars think we need to be measuring Christian nationalism a little bit better. So Paul Jupe has kind of been at the lead of this, as have some other folks, to try to really measure this concept in a little bit of a more specific and precise way. And I think Miles and I are both actually very supportive of that because some of the measurement could be a little bit stronger, we think. Although the scale we use, we think, is not bad, but it can be improved on. And then just an interesting open research question is the effect of Christian nationalism beyond white Christian communities. Christian nationalism is actually relatively strong among African Americans, but it doesn't correlate with any of this problematic stuff, right? There's a lot of work to be done on kind of Hispanic and Latino communities, right? And sort of how these Christian nationalist beliefs might play out in those contexts, right? Which are rapidly growing both in evangelical America and in Catholic America. And have interesting political salience. So there's a lot of interesting work to continue to do, and we're glad to share a little bit of it with you today. And definitely happy to continue the conversation now, but also later on if folks want to follow up. So thank you very much for your attention on a Friday midday.
Yeah, it's funny that we landed on this time. It just seems to work out. It's a lot of people's lunch hours, and today I think we may have even broken a record. I think this is the most. We had 56 people at one point. So thank you, gentlemen. I know that you scratched an itch for all of our data nerds that are watching today. Let's see. So this one comes actually from a sitting school board member in Scottsdale, Arizona, which has gotten all kinds of attention, most of it not good because of these people. And as I said in the chat earlier, most of these evangelical extremists who are on our school boards, almost every single one that I track every week has all of these characteristics. It's really a fascinating discussion. But Julie Sanowski, who's the president of SUSD, says, how do we change the rhetoric and relationship between the initial category, victimhood, white insecurities, Christian nationalism, etc., and extreme responses from a political point of view?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Dave.
Well, I'll talk on the religion and politics literature side, and then I think you have some stuff there too, Miles. So I can say that there's some research that I've seen recently from Paul Jupe, actually, and Amy Erica Smith at Iowa State University, where they're trying to effectively sort of test different approaches to diminishing Christian nationalism or diminishing its political importance, right? And so you could look into their research, Paul Jupe and Amy Erica Smith she's at Iowa State. As I recall, the initial findings, they're trying to, in particular, kind of diminish senses of threat around religion and kind of putting a finger on that as a real source of challenge in motivation for Christian nationalist folks. Right now, how do you turn that into like a practical policy recommendation, diminishing threat? I don't know about much research yet on that, but I think that's where scholars are actively working now a little bit. Miles, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so in one aspect, there's a lot like from the conspiratorial research about sort of deprogramming. That's not exactly the right word, and that runs the risk of getting into some of what Dave was talking about earlier with Islam and sort of moderate Islam networks. But there is empirical work that shows there are effective ways to sort of deprogram, if you will. And so one of the things that I think of is that there's ways to reveal objective states to people that do not cause backlash. It's important to note that all of the things that we talk about, white identity, perceived victimhood, and QAnon support, are perceptual in nature. And it's possible that people arrive at some conclusions because they lack perceptual acuity. And so helping people see that their perception doesn't align with reality in non-threatening ways, there's plenty of evidence out there, but it's going to be difficult no matter what, because they're getting reinforcement of their existing attitudes in other avenues, often much more frequently than any sort of counter messaging. And people select into their messaging networks and like echo chambers. So I think it's difficult to reveal to people that the way you're thinking is incommensurate with what's really going on. But there is plenty of evidence out there on how that works.
We have there's a lot of conversation. We have some really smart people who attend these all the time, and I see somebody's hands raised, but go ahead and just put it into the chat or in the Q&A. But there's a question here from Farrell. Is there a connection between Christian nationalism and anti-Semitism?
So off the top of my head, I honestly can't remember coming out of this literature. I know sort of Islamophobic or anti-Islamic beliefs. I'm quite confident of that I do remember that from other scholars' research. I wouldn't want to speak out of turn and be incorrect on that. The folks I would point you to, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry have done a lot of this research, kind of correlating Christian nationalist belief with all sorts of problematic stuff. And I would bet that they've done something related to anti-Semitism. Maybe Miles can do a quick lit review while I'm blathering on here to stall. But anyway, I don't know if you remember off the top of your head, Miles.
Paul Jupe has something recently with another co-author where they find that people high in Christian nationalism support anti-Semitic tropes, right? Which is functionally indistinguishable from anti-Semitism. And they also, but importantly, they also find that it's not just anti-Semitism, it's all religious minorities. And then there's also, this is an interesting one in particular for our presentation today. If you combine Christian nationalism with those anti-Semitic attitudes, in combination, those things actually boost support for QAnon. So it's all of these sort of messaging circles, these environments that people are in are sort of reinforcing one another, it appears.
Let's see, there's like I said, there's a lot of comments here. One thing that I forgot to mention is actually that this Monday, next coming Monday, the 4th, Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix is going to have a special speaker, Kevin Bowling, who's going to talk about the next generation of the secular movement. So I just wanted to go ahead and throw details in there because I thought it was an exciting talk, you know, because one of the things that's going on nowadays too is, you know, we see that younger people are increasingly, you know, non-theistic or just don't attend church. They're the nuns, right? Like they don't adhere to any kind of religion. So I guess my question to you is, you know, in the research that you do, where, you know, do you break it up necessarily into demographics and specifically with age groups?
That's a good question on age in this project. I actually don't know that we broke down these effects to see if they were different across age categories. Do you remember, Miles? Did we look into that?
I'm scrolling here. I don't know if people can see this part of my screen.
No,
I've got
hearing actually, but that's okay.
Oh, I did.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I've got the paper pulled up. One moment, I can reshare my screen. Sorry about that.
And in the meantime, I just want to share like some of the praise that we have here. People are coming from South Carolina. There's a local journalist that would like to share this information. We got to the question about Christian nationalism and anti-Semitism. Somebody said the Mormons are all libertarians. We have a lot of Mormons out here.
That's another talk. Yeah, that's another talk.
A totally different talk. Yeah. So go ahead.
Across the board here, it seems that age is negatively related to support for violence and the belief that the Capitol riot is justified. Now, it's important to note that just from a statistical perspective, it's hard to say in a model with many different statistical controls that this is, you know, a robust effect in all contexts, but it sure seems that young people are less likely to support violence. We don't necessarily speculate on why that may be the case, but and then in subsequent additional work with Adam Enders, we similarly see that age is well, I'm not sure where it appears here, but age too here is negatively related to support for the Capitol riot. So young people do not seem to be fans of political violence.
Oh, yeah, thank goodness.
And just on, you know, you mentioned the rise of the nuns, right, of the unaffiliated, and you know, like we've got really good quantitative evidence now that, and qualitative, honestly, that part of the rise of the nuns has been a reaction against kind of conservative politicized religion, for lack of a better word, going back to kind of, you know, even the 90s, right, and even maybe into the 80s. Young people saying, well, if that's what Christianity is, I guess I'm not Christian anymore, right? I think it's actually going to be really interesting to see whether, and there's some research going on that's looking at this. I assume that the rise of kind of Christian nationalist cues is going to do a similar thing, right? That young people will react potentially even more strongly or additionally strongly against that kind of politicization of religion. Yeah, as far as I know, research that's directly on that point is still coming out. There's a political scientist at Notre Dame, David Campbell, too, actually, and Jeffrey Lehman, who, if folks are interested in the nuns and the rise of the nuns, they would be worth looking into their research.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so every Friday we have these discussions on various topics, most, you know, obviously circling around the idea of secularism and often dealing with the topic of Christian nationalism. And, you know, it's hard sometimes, right, to find hope in these times. You know, people were, you know, defecating in the nation's capital and the QAnon shaman is running for Congress. So sometimes it's hard to find hope. But as always, it seems to be Gen Z. That's kind of what we end up landing on. But from the two of you who are in the thick of this kind of research, I'd love to hear from you to end, because it is 12:55. I want to honor your time and thank you for being so gracious with your time for us. I'm telling you, we broke records today. This is a fascinating topic, and you made numbers easy for this English teacher to understand. So in doing this kind of work that can be really depressing, what gives you all hope?
Well, you should have prepared us for that question off the cuff. What gives me hope? Wow. I think something that we ended with, that Dave's discussed at the very end, is that not a lot of people support these things. Now, the rub there is that it only takes a few people to cause death and destruction, but their actions are not widely supported, to the tune of 17% in the top quartile of all of those things. Sure, that's millions of people, but I think that the rest of America has widely decried their efforts, in particular on January 6th, and violence itself is not particularly supported. And so just the idea that these are people on the fringe, and hopefully we can bring them back into the fold of society, but these are people on the fringe, and it's unlikely to be many of our neighbors, if it's any of our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, somebody who comes at this from the study of religion and politics in particular, and beyond the U.S. in a lot of my research, the U.S. has a usable history when it comes to religious pluralism and democracy that I do think gives us some advantages, right? I mean, we've had violence related to Catholic immigration. We've had violence related to Jewish immigration. We now have violence related to Muslim immigration. And we have, certain instability associated with the rise of more secular communities. But we have done this before as a country. And I do think that having that usable history of pluralism and of equality under the law, this is an advantage that a lot of countries don't have, to be honest. Yes, there are people who think you need to be Christian to be an American, but not most Americans, right? And that's an advantage that we should treasure as a country. With that said, there's deep-seated challenges to getting out of this equilibrium that we're in, because even relative political minorities, especially under our institutions in this country, can gather political leverage and can use that leverage to distort democratic politics in problematic ways.
Mm-hmm. I've been lucky enough to see Andrew Seidel several times over the past several years, and this last year, the overarching message that he had in his discussions was that this is the dying gasp of the GOP or evangelical extremists, the MAGA types, and he said their rage, he took that Dylan Thomas poem, they're raging against the dying of their privilege. And the only thing that gives him pause, of course, is the courts, because, we know how many appointments Trump made, and that's a whole different discussion. So when you have that research done, we'll be sure to call you back. Now, I do have one more question here that came up in the last couple of minutes from Evangeline. And she says, when we see an increase in Zionism, Christian nationalism, conspiracy theories, support for violence, etc., how can we interpret statistics numbers as a way to shape the future of our society?
I think if we are lucky enough to have data that reveals trends, then we can understand what the response, what the scope of the response should be. That is one sort of unfortunate thing in many instances. It's hard to say, are we perceiving a rise or is there a legitimate rise? And when we have good enough data to see that there is a rise rather than us perceiving a rise. And so conspiracy theory or attraction to conspiracy theories is a nice example.
Mm-hmm.
Conspiracism has not risen by and large. Our exposure to individuals attracted to conspiracy theories has risen, and their status has risen, but the attraction to them really hasn't. And there's plenty of strong academic research that shows that. And so knowing that information helps us make policy choices. So being able to take statistics and determine, is this the squeaky wheel getting the grease all of a sudden, or is there actually a rise? That really helps us make policy choices.
Mhm. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think if anything, the message then for this weekend, maybe like, turn off your social media, stop paying attention to the news, go touch grass, pet your dog, I don't know, climb a mountain, do something better than, feeding that machine. And you want to learn more about that, there's a really great, I think it's on Netflix, called The Social Experiment, which talks about how social media affects our general angst. So, but let's not have any angst this weekend. And again, thank you so much, Doctors Armaly and Dr. Buckley, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I know everybody here does. You help us break a record, and I hope that you have a wonderful, hopeful weekend without social media as well.
Thanks so
Bye,
much for
everybody.
having us.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank
everybody.
you.
Great questions. Yeah, thanks.
Bye, y'all.
Take care.